So we can go there. Is Mark?
You want me to talk? Testing, testing, testing. Good morning. Good afternoon.
Laurel's not there. And she and Laurel and Nancy are all. But Nancy's going to be saving the more. Laurel's not there. I'll tell her.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to this celebration of the life of Ardeth Billings Fortier, a long name of a woman who lived a long and rich life. Some of you began the world, life in it, in her womb. Some of you came to meet her in your journey through it, whether as family or friends, in church, in the larger world, or drawn somehow into her magnetic orbit of love and laughter and wisdom and so much else. All of us were lucky to have known Ardeth, and so it's with incredible gratitude, I think you'd agree, for celebration of all the years that we've had with her, however many they numbered, that we are gathered here in this sacred space this afternoon. And it's also with deep sadness and mourning that we're gathered. Love, the Reverend Forrest Church once wrote, is grief's advance party. We do not mourn what we do not love, and our grief is in proportion to that love. So holding all of this, we are gathered here in a community she would have loved to have seen assembled. So, Ardeth, if the mysteries of life and afterlife allow, welcome to this embrace of you. Our goals this afternoon will include trying to bring as much of Ardeth's life into this space as possible, into this weaving of the story and the loves that were hers. There will be sharing of facets of her life by loved ones. There will be poems and readings that she loved or would have loved. The music was chosen with her in mind, most of it specifically requested over the years by family who took diligent notes. Some of it, like the Vidor piece, which you'll hear later, which took weeks of preparation, so those of us who hang out in church have been lucky enough to be steeped in it. All of it speaking of the extraordinary beauty, her love of artistry, her love of that generative force that's at the heart of life, that is what flowed so unceasingly through her own. All of it we will honor today. Some of you may know, especially if you were involved in cleaning out some of her things or part of her everyday life, that at some point she started to leave notes all over the place, in clippings, in her books, in drawers. These are words that she found, that she liked, of wisdom, funny ones, pointed observations, written on colored index cards or cut out scraps of paper. Chaos is the law of nature, order is the dream of man. Henry Adams, she wrote on one. Right below it, the address of the St. Francis Fountain and Candy Store. Life is a continuing course of adult education. Bill Moyers. New England in John Updike's autobiography, quote, "a tact in the people which wordlessly acknowledges another's right to an inner life and private strangeness." And a unison affirmation cut from a long ago order of service of this congregation, words by William Henry Channing. I'd invite you, if you have a gray hymnal tucked in front of you, to turn all the way to the back to number 484. Let's say the words together. to live content with small means, to seek elegance rather than luxury, and refinement rather than fashion, to be worthy, not respectable, and wealthy, not rich, to study hard, think quietly, talk gently, act frankly, to listen to stars and birds, to babes and sages with open heart, to bear all cheerfully, do all bravely, await occasions, hurry never, to let the spiritual, unbidden and unconscious grow up through the common. This is to be my symphony. With these words, we gather and begin the celebration of Ardeth's life. Welcome, everyone. I light our chalice in the spirit of her. And I'll begin our sharing of readings and stories by inviting Tom Steer, her son, to open with a Mary Oliver poem.
This is called When Death Comes. When death comes like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through that door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore, I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood, and I look upon time as no more than an idea, and I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy, and as singular. And each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending, as all music does, towards silence. And each body a lion of courage and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say all my life, I was a bride, married to amazement. I was a bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I had made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world.
So often when we get to know someone, we meet them at one place in their life. Even our children meet us at only one place in our life. And no one knows the full story. Well, no one really ever knows the full story, but there are always these other chapters. And so We'll talk today about, or I will, with so much help from Ardeth's children, as much as we could in quite a few minutes, but so you get the full arc of her extraordinary life, if you didn't already know it, or only knew parts. Ardeth Billings Owen was born in 1929 in Spokane, Washington, a backwater when she was born there, with a big age gap between her and her brother Robert and sister Gwyneth. And so she grew up a bit like an only child. Because they lived in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other, she had enormous freedom. She wandered from backyard to backyard, and her dog would go with her, so the family figured she was safe. She loved that wandering. Every Sunday, for instance, she would take a walk, heading out in a different direction, and she would go as far as she could, as fast as she could. She loved looking at, she said, the different homes and landscapes. I liked being alone with my imagination, she said. Later, she'd say how much she wanted always to travel, just as she had as a kid, alone, free of everyone's schedule, free to wander and discover the place she was in. Ardeth was a bit lonely as a kid, but very happy. It was a sweet and idyllic childhood. She lived near her grandmother and aunts, surrounded by family. Ardeth loved to swim, and the family had a second home in Yosemite, Idaho, across the border from Spokane, right near Spirit Lake, where they would spend their summers. With her dad, who was a bookkeeper at a hotel in town, coming out on weekends, always with an armful of books from the Spokane Library. Ardeth was also very bright, and the local Spokane schools weren't really challenging her. But sometime just after the fall of 1941, with war breaking out, Ardeth's father was called up in the National Guard and transferred to Maine. Her dad was made the head of the Presque Isle and base, and since the nearby educational system her parents didn't think was very strong, Ardeth's parents told her that she could attend any boarding school of her choosing, assuming she got in. She chose Buckingham, now Buckingham Brown and Nichols in Cambridge. And she went to live with a cousin and her family. That family was musical and exposed Ardeth to a lot of music. Ardeth told of riding her bicycle to the Boston Symphony. She used to attend lectures at Harvard. She joined the Unitarian Church in Cambridge and even preached a sermon there in high school. Ardeth says she may be one of the only people who credits the war with positive change in her life. She loved every second of that time, though it also marked another big sea change. In some ways, during that time, she also lost her family. Her brother disappeared in action during the war. Her sister got married. So they all never lived again under a single roof, which was a sadness for her. After high school graduation, Ardeth spent one semester working as a law clerk because she didn't get into Pomona in the fall, but by spring, she was on campus. And once there, she met a man. A handsome, charming man named James Henry Steer, and the two were married within a year and a half. James would study to be a doctor of veterinary medicine, and they would have a life of wandering and adventures. In 13 years, their family would include 6 children: Robin, Leslie, Carrie, Melinda, Thomas, and Robert. And Ardeth said she would have had more if she could have. She loved being pregnant. And she loved each of her kids for the unique person they were when they came into the world. And she was bent on giving them, her children, the best of what she had loved in her own childhood. Things like that freedom to roam and be kids. When they lived in Grant Pass on their 24-acre farm, when Robin and Leslie were little, they got on logs and rode down irrigation ditches. They crawled on sheds, waded in the ponds with the ducks and the geese. Carrie remembers them sitting under Rex's leg, Rex being a giant horse, and playing underneath him. They swam in water troughs. Ardeth believed that children would learn their limits and their capabilities. Carrie and Leslie would go alone into the hills on their horses, no grown-ups along. Ardeth gave good, practical advice, like what her father had given her, things like the three-point rule. How many people here know what the three-point rule is? Oh yeah, Ardeth's children know it. So now we'll all know. So, which is if you're climbing a tree or anything else, always have 3 limbs solid on it with only 1 limb moving at a time. Rules like if you climb up something, you can get down from it. She tried to keep them out of dangerous things, but they got into things they shouldn't, like the loft in the barn where there was hay and old furniture, and from which they could jump onto a big pile of hay below, swinging on ropes until they dropped into it. There could have been pitchforks in the hay, but lucky for all of them, there never was. To escape her mother, who came looking for them once because she was mad, knowing some of what they must have been up to, Leslie once crawled down a ladder into a stall with a bull in it, but lived to tell the tale. Ardeth taught them you can't get onto the horses or ride bikes without real shoes, but they did it anyway, and she patched them up. When they went walking in the wilderness, you had to have a rattlesnake kit in the mountains, which is to say, in case you're wondering, as I was, a knife so you can cut an X in your skin where the bite is and suck out the venom, and a bandana to use as a tourniquet. Ardeth did make time for her own pleasures. She secretly smoked during much of the time the kids were little, which may have explained why she was eager to have them go out on adventures. She loved reading and wanted time to read books, and sometimes she would lock herself in the bathroom for an hour or two just to have it, and everyone knew you weren't allowed to interrupt Mom when she was in the bathroom unless you were really hurt. And she gave her whole self to try and make sure none of her kids felt, she gave her whole self, always wanting to make sure that none of her kids ever felt unloved. They never felt like she resented them, because she didn't, despite the immense amount that all of them and life together must have required. Ardeth's core was unconditional love. There was sometimes chaos and dysfunction in the household, but her kids always knew that she was there and she would love them, and she certainly had their backs. Early on, when they were little, she had a temper, so Robin probably got the worst of that time. But Ardeth learned quickly to rein it in, and her younger kids hardly remember that about her. Ardeth, ever the reader, ever exploring in mind and body, read Summerhill about a liberal school in England where, among other things, they didn't believe in corporal punishment, and she stopped spanking her kids. Ardeth evolved as a human, as a mom, and this quality of being able to evolve, it was one of the greatest gifts that she gave her children. That example. Ardeth and James moved around a lot. Some of that was James's curiosity and desire for growth and change and adventure. Later in life, though, he would also admit he was trying to outrun something in himself. It meant for a lot of different experiences as a family. They lived in California, in Woodland, when James was in vet school. They lived in Oregon when James was doing his residency, and Ardeth's mom would move in with them for a while so that Ardeth could continue to get some of her college credits commuting to Reed College. They moved to Grants Pass, Oregon, north of Ashland, where James bought a practice. They even started a Unitarian Universalist fellowship with 4 other families while they were there, and a church that still exists. And then in 1958, James got a 1-year Fulbright to study veterinary medicine, veterinary dairy, in Denmark, Copenhagen, and they took the adventure overseas. The family moved in 1959 to Santa Barbara, where James had a job at a think tank, writing about the future, but quickly decided he preferred being in the field and practicing the healing medicine that he was best at. So not so long after that, in 1964, the family moved to Boston, where James got a scholarship to study public health at Harvard. They took the time to drive across country both ways with the kids. They weren't wealthy at this time. This year in Boston, the family had food stamps, and they can remember Ardeth returning food at the checkout because she didn't have the money. Throughout their childhood, they struggled, the family did, with finances. James was a really good healer, a good vet, but also bad at collecting money and bookkeeping. But Ardeth never seemed to worry. When they came back west, this time to Petaluma, here, the children also didn't recognize how precocious their finances were, in part because no one, they said, knew how to get more food out of $1. Ardeth would always manage to feed the kids, the swarms of kids that would land up regularly in her home after school. Why did they land up? Well, Leslie remembers when she invited friends over how her friends would first ask, "Is your mom going to be there?" And if she was, then they would come. They loved her. That's why she has all these bonus kids, some of whom are here today as she came to call them. One of these kids mentioned that Ardeth added to her sense of who her family was. Robin said their house was one where friends could be themselves. People would later say, "Your mom saw me for who I was and would talk to me like I was a person," at a time when no one else did that with kids. Ardeth gave people the freedom to talk about anything, even if she was clear about the boundaries of life too. A friend remembers her saying he could live there with her, but absolutely could not buy or sell drugs in their house, and she meant it. While in Petaluma, they lived in this big Victorian house. It had a whole room that was just a library, but it also needed some work. With its old knob and tube wiring, the boys realized that if they turned on the heater and the iron at the same time, they could blow the fuse out of the whole house, which they thought was really fun, until the day that PG&E threatened if they did it again that they would condemn the house. It was about this time that Ardeth and James divorced. It was a messy divorce, with James fighting for custody, which Ardeth won, ultimately. Afterwards, Ardeth decided to finish her degree. She took classes at Sonoma State and finally got her BA in the late 1960s. While she was there, she also met and fell in love with one of her teachers, Ardeth Fortier, who was a professor of psychology. When Joe's marriage ended, Joe and Ardeth married. Early in their marriage, when Reagan was governor and Nixon was president, and Joe was leading teach-outs about Vietnam, Joe and Ardeth decided it was time to leave the United States, given the direction politics were going. I know some of us have felt that way in recent history, too. In case you wonder what their suggestion would be, they moved to Ireland, taking the younger kids, Melinda, Robert, Tom. It was 1972. When Nixon resigned, Ardeth said with gusto, "I told you that bastard would do something." Life in Ireland was lovely, but in July of 1974, Joe was offered a job at the University of Maryland, teaching at the base in Munich, so the family made plans then to move to Germany. Robert had previously returned to live with his father. Tom decided he wanted to stay in Ireland and finish high school, staying with a local family. These decisions by the boys to split away from her were hard on Ardeth, heartbreaking, but she always understood her kids' right and need for independence, and so she allowed them to make these choices. Melinda had graduated from the Irish high school and took off for adventures in Europe, so Joe and Ardeth moved to Germany without any children. Back in the US, by 1977, Joe and Ardeth settled again in California, which they decided was the safest place in case of nuclear war. Joe and Ardeth were a very happy couple. Joe had some struggles with alcoholism, but the kids remember that at night you could hear them talking when you fell asleep, chatting together, and you could hear them talking when you woke up in the morning. They were deeply compatible souls. Joe's death was hard for Ardeth. And she decided that she wanted to earn a living. Ardeth was in her late 50s, but in 1987, she enrolled in nursing school, and in classic Ardeth fashion, she completed the degree in 2 years, pursuing the more rigorous RN degree as she did so. Ardeth and her friend Jean Stoner would travel across a very treacherous mountain road to get to school. There were lots of winter adventures. And never letting the grass grow beneath her feet for very long, as soon as she got her degree, Ardeth signed up with the Peace Corps and went to Costa Rica for 2 years, working with elders, doing adaptive physical therapy. Several of her kids went at some point and spent time with her there. When she left the Peace Corps, she moved back to San Francisco. She lived in the Mission District in a house that was originally and still is a boarding house. She shared the upstairs floor with 2 male housemates, all sharing a bathroom down the hall. Her kids remember that you'd have to yell up from the street to her for her to come down and let you in. One day that would change. While spending a beautiful day in Half Moon Bay with her son-in-law Jean and daughter Carrie, Carrie made the mistake or the good fortunate decision to go to the bathroom and returned to find the 2 of them with big grins on their faces. Ardeth said triumphantly, "We're going to buy a house together." It turns out that while Ardeth was working and living in her mission apartment, she'd been saving money, and so she offered to put money as a down payment on a house. And they did just that, and she moved out of the boarding house on 18th Street, and the 3 of them bought a house. And Ardeth lived there with Jean and Carrie ever after. In fact, she lived in that house longer than she lived anywhere else in her life. Somewhere early in her time back in San Francisco, she also joined this church. She loved the organ and the music, all of it. Carrie decided that if she wanted to spend time with her mother, the best bet was to come to church, so they started coming to church together, and Carrie got pulled into the vortex. They sang in the choir. Ardeth would deliver food to people who needed it, advocate for social justice. By the time I arrived, she was the honorary mother of everyone who needed an honorary mother. I also wonder if Ardeth found in Unitarian Universalism the easiest way to find her pack. She was always ahead of her time in politics, in child-rearing ideals, in diet and health. She was the mom who helped Robin's friends evade the draft during Vietnam, who was fiercely anti-war. She was the first person who told Robin about systemic racism, naming the fact that most of the kids who got drafted to Vietnam were brown or black, and at UU Church, she was in good company. Outside of church, she was certainly just as busy and active. She loved the outdoors, as many of you know. She loved nature her whole life, supported environmental causes however she could. Late in life, she loved to go backpacking, going on one trip when she was 60 and another trip with Melinda when she was 66. She had lots of friends, which her curiosity and generous ability to listen deeply made it so easy for her to attract and keep. She loved her kids and grandkids. She was famous for her immense patience, especially for toddlers. No one was as happy to watch a dump truck at a construction site for as long as they did, except maybe Ardeth. She worked until she was 75. In fact, the photo that's on the cover of the Order of Service today, it was taken in 2004 at her retirement party. Shortly thereafter, her sister Gwyneth was diagnosed with terminal cancer and decided not to treat it. And when it got bad, Ardeth traveled and took care of Gwen. She continued to love to travel. In 2007, on a choir trip to Transylvania, Carrie said her mother's dementia was just starting to show. And with that dementia, life got a little more circumscribed, but no less joyful. Family was a constant and enormous joy. Church and singing were a constant and a joy. I once even saw Ardeth's photo in the DeYoung Museum's magazine, so clearly she was getting out in the world of culture. And whenever you saw her, as you all know, you were always met with a smile and a kind word and that unfailingly generous and loving spirit of welcome that she just brought with her wherever she went. You wanted to be with her. As Maya Angelou says, you won't remember what people said, but you'll remember how they made you feel. And she made you feel adored. Enough, more than enough. She made her kids feel that way. She made us all feel that way. If you ask her family what words they would use to describe their mother, they will say, fierce. Fiercely loving, fiercely protective, that she was strong and resourceful and inventive, that she had vast intellectual curiosity, that she was ahead of her time, progressive and valiant about what she believed. Leslie said she's realizing now what a vast interior life Ardeth had, which in the midst of raising 6 kids somehow ran like this vibrant underground river in her. She was an extraordinary woman who led an extraordinary life of adventure, exploration, love, connection, fierce interrogation, and service. Her life was easy and not easy. Her childhood was idyllic in many ways and hard for her in certain ways. Her marriages were to 2 men whose substance abuse issues were there, and all those moves she did, I imagine that was tough, and sometimes with not being with enough money, but she loved life and loved those who she spent it with, and she never played favorites with her kids, adoring each of them and seeing them for who they were. And she pulled other kids and loved ones and people into her circle of care and honorary children, and she was generous with everything that she had to share whenever she had it. And the world was her playground, and each day was like the Sunday of her childhood, this invitation to walk as far as you could in a different direction and see what you could find and live in your imagination and delight. Ardeth died in her bed, in the home that she had conspired with Jean to buy, the one she lived in longer than she'd lived in any other place. She was surrounded by family. She was washed in a fraction of the love that she spread with lavish hand every day of her life, and love overflowed from that room. Truth is, this may be as good as it gets for a life.
chestnut trees, the wishing well. I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you. I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places, in that this heart of mine embraces all day through. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be seeing you.
I'm Robin. I'm Artie's oldest daughter, and one of the places that I remember Mom best is being here, because the only time I came to here was with her, and I love this church. So it's good to be here, even though I really miss her. My mom loved words all her life. She told me really late in life, after she had dementia, that she'd always wanted to be a poet. I don't know if that was actually true, but she certainly raised us to love words and to read and enjoy traveling and the things that happened in words. She told me once that when she went to France, she was so excited because it was just like all the books that she'd read made her imagine it. You kind of go into death brain, that's what I call it, after somebody dies. So I was lucky that some words came to me still. And this is a poem for her. You loved us. You loved us like a furnace in the basement of a brownstone in winter, like a front porch on an August night, like an open hand in the rain. You loved us from autumn into mid-July, like a catalpa whirly-gigging us away into the winds. Or like a tree in a northwest rainforest, rooting us in your body. Your love was never like a vine or a fence, sometimes like a sheepdog barking and nipping at our heels. You loved us like a mother bear teaching us how to steal honey from stinging bees, like a baboon screaming while you cuddled us, throwing us onto your back to bare your teeth at anyone who threatened. You loved us like a guy with the broom at the end of a parade, and you loved us like broken glass under our feet, like duty, like a contract with no escape clause, never like padlocks or closed doors. Your love was a safe deposit box, keeping everything of us while you let toys and china and all those houses slip behind. And always, your love was like river heading out to sea, and the canoes on it, and the paddles in our hands, like a sail, like a rudder, like lines, gravity holding us to ground, sky and horizon clear to compass by.
I'm Leslie, the second daughter, and I'll keep this brief, mostly because I'm overcome by the presence of all of you gathering in the midst of war and global pandemic to honor one person, my mother. And also because standing in front of you here, trying to say anything meaningful scares the hell out of me. And I love this church because you can say a word like that and nobody smites you. Thank you. The laughter is a gift from Mom, so laughing is good. My thanks to all of you, and especially to Reverend Vanessa Rush Southern, who has been so wonderful during and after my mother's death that I could almost get religious. And my sister Carrie, who pretty much single-handedly planned this service with the church. None of us speaking today can encapsulate this woman's life within an hour, no matter how many words we use. So I'm going to focus on the elements that have been especially haunting to me over the past few months since Mom's death. My siblings and I have spent many hours since then sorting through her belongings, the artifacts, photographs, random notes, and diaries she managed to keep with her through all her travels that Vanessa talked about. And in excavating her life fully as we could from beginning to end, partly for this service, we have been excavating our childhoods as well, comparing memories and filling each other in on experiences some of us had missed. For example, when half the family moved to Ireland and half of us stayed stateside for several years. Or times we older siblings had with our parents before the younger ones were born, and that the younger ones had after the big kids left home. And what I realized from all of this is that what I missed, and now always will be missing, is not so much the mother I knew, but the person I did not know, because I saw her only as my mother. And she was so much more than the woman who raised 6 of what at least one relative called heathens to become productive, responsible, and sometimes joyful adults, all of whom are here today with their own families. As Vanessa alluded, she was a woman who dug deeply into the mess of life and appreciated all its smells and textures. She was an inveterate reader, that much I knew, who jotted down passages from favorite authors on scraps of paper, tiny calendars, and index cards. This I did not know. As you heard earlier, she was a woman who dreamt of traveling alone, poking off into the off-grid places to see how people lived and how they felt. She was a woman eternally interested in humanity, human rights, and global politics. When she did not have money, which was most of our life with her, she made do. When she did have money, she gave it away to the people and causes she believed in. While she was nursing babies and milking cows and hanging clothes on the line and counting out food stamps at the grocery store and packing our lunch bags, she was also exploring the world and our place in it in ways I only now am beginning to appreciate. I wish I'd known. I wish I'd asked her more about what she was thinking and feeling while she was growing up and while she was growing us up. I wish I had known her as a friend, because although as a mother she sometimes embarrassed or enraged me, because after all we were in our own way a kind of a normal family with rageful teenagers, she always had my back. I never questioned whether she loved me. She loved without reservation or expectation. And she was always ready for the next adventure. And if that's not the definition of good friendship material, I don't know what it is. So with her death, I find myself mourning the friend I never knew, even more than I mourn the mother I always had. People often speak of legacies. My mother did not leave trust funds, rare jewels, or fancy anythings behind for us. Instead, her legacy was this: in terms of love, acceptance, support, and joy in each other's companies. I don't know another family as richly endowed as ours. And that is thanks in a very large part to our mother and the way she wholly loved each of us. The legacy I want to leave today in honor of Ardeth Billings Fortier is this urging: don't wait too long to love your family from the outside in, as well as from the traditional inside out. As perfectly flawed, fascinating, fallible, distinct, fragile, superpowered human beings. Show yourself to be curious about them. Don't be afraid to make them friends and to insist on taking your own active part in the friendship. Don't miss what's here. Thank you.
Gently over Jordan,
Melinda, fourth daughter. The few things I'm going to talk about were alluded to earlier because these were common themes in my mom's life. Books and reading. We are all avid readers. In the video, there's a picture of young mom sitting in a giant chair with a giant book in her lap. And this was in an era when very few photographs were taken. Our love of books was instilled at an early age by our mom, and many a Saturday morning was spent happily at the public library. I don't know how happy the librarians were with 6 rowdy kids. I'm going to read an excerpt from a letter she wrote to me when she was a Peace Corps volunteer in Costa Rica. It kind of gives a taste of her adventures there and highlights how important books were to her. It was written when she was 61 years old in March 1990. Guess I'd better break my writer's block to let you know I survived our Costa Rican earthquake. Tremblers at 6.5. Scary as hell. And now I know how some of the afternerves that you had in San Francisco. There was no real damage. The epicenter was a few, just off the point of Guanacaste Peninsula. Just some pieces fell off the church and a few facade cracks. I was awake, but being lazy in bed, as it was Sunday, when I felt the bed rocking. No matter how much the kids upstairs act up, it never rocks the house, built as most homes there were of concrete blocks. I'm gonna lose my place here. And besides, the kids weren't even out of bed yet. While I was thinking this, I heard the wooden door and window frames cracking and rattling. I began to realize what was happening and that I was under the weight of the house. I hesitated in the doorframe, and then I thought, no way, that didn't help in SF. So I went out and stood in the clear area by the swimming pool. Of course, there was no way to escape if the house fell forward, but there were no power lines. The water in the pool was sloshing back and forth, trees rustling, clothes on the line swaying like a jump rope. Very undulating movement, quiet, and seemed to go on for a long time. Finally stopped. I went back to bed to read a little. And it started again. This time I whipped outside fast. Undulations were much stronger. I thought, boy, are you prepared. In my nightgown, bare feet, and a paperback in my hand. We have many images of my mom barefoot with a paperback or a book in her hand. Love. It's been spoken of a lot tonight. As Vanessa said, my mom was very generous with I forwarded the incredible obituary Carrie wrote to my friends, and one of them wrote back, remarking, "Your mom was amazing, resilient, and obviously full of love for her family and her friends. She kept her love for her family and her friends to the very end of her life. While Alzheimer's ravaged her intelligence and her speech capabilities, her capacity for love remained steadfast. She would look at me, her brown eyes bright with love, love not bound by any conditions and not hampered by any filters. In her very last months, when she was capable of very little else, Mom was still holding up her face, her lips puckering, asking for, giving, and receiving kisses. Thank you, Mom, Artie, Ardeth, Grandma, Aunt, cousin, mother-in-law, friend, and so much else for all the love that you poured into this world. This is what Mom wrote to me when someone I loved very dearly died. Memories are nurturing, warming, disturbing, a way to be our own storytellers, and a source of wisdom, a way of being our best. I hope that I can hold these memories shared today close to my heart, keeping her with me and with us.
I'm John Sheehy, a friend. When we're young, some of us have the good fortune of finding a mentor, someone who sees a potential in us that others don't, and who is willing to provide us with a guiding light toward realizing that potential. The word mentor actually comes from the name of a character in Homer's book, The Odyssey. Mentor was the person who was entrusted with the education of Odysseus' son when Odysseus went off to fight in the Trojan War, and then spent another 10 years wandering, trying to find his way back home. Now, in my case, the roles were somewhat reversed. I left home shortly after graduating from high school and set off for Europe with a backpack for 4 years. Along the way, I took as my mentor an incarnation of Odysseus in the lovely form of Artie. I had a passing acquaintance already with Artie back home in Petaluma as the mother of my classmate Carrie. But when I first encountered her and Joe in their little cottage overlooking the Shannon River in West County Clare, our connection as kindred souls was instantaneous. We spent hours in the kitchen, the only warm room perhaps in an Irish cottage, talking about everything under the sun: politics, history, religion, literature, philosophy, and of course, psychology. All infused with Artie's contagious enthusiasm, curiosity, and good humor. For an aspiring autodidact like myself, out to study the world firsthand and not find myself on some college assembly line, it was pure heaven. Not long after that visit, Artie and Joe moved to Munich. Joe went to work at University of Maryland, and Artie took a job at the nearby headquarters of the company that ran the PXs on American military bases in Europe. Their Munich apartment became my refuge from the road as I hitchhiked back and forth across Europe. It was a place where I could recharge and re-engage, especially with Artie and Joe, in our far-reaching discussions around the kitchen table. We were all bookaholics. We would all gather at dinner and just talk about the books we were reading. Artie, though, was always the first to call it a night, anxious to curl up in bed with whatever mystery novel she was reading at the time. Some evenings, Joe's faculty colleagues joined us, and that was a real group of eccentric intellectuals from all over the world. And we'd have sort of a literary salon with Artie serving as our host, employing her gracious humor and her infectious laughter to keep things, especially Joe, from going off the rails. And then after 2 years of hitchhiking around Europe, working odd jobs, I hit a wall personally. I was broke and burned out. And I barely made my way back to Munich, where Artie nursed me back to health. And then she helped me find a place to live in a little free attic garret with a bunch of guest workers. And she also got me a clerical job at the PX headquarters where she worked. Then in a very weird twist of fate, some months later, I was made an office supervisor, managing a group of people twice my age, including Artie. Now, for most people, having to report to a scruffy 20-year-old road bum that you've just helped scrape off the streets would be somewhat awkward, to say the least, but not Ardeth. She stepped in as my mentor, sharing her incredible wealth of emotional intelligence and coaching me on how to manage this crazy office of Germans and American expatriates I was charged with. And because she had a master's degree, actually, in psychology from Sonoma State, and Joe was a psychology professor, that included a deep dive into the study of Myers-Briggs typology to understand how to work with others, all new to me. Ardeth's type was INFP, which stands for Introverted, Intuitive, Feeling, Perceptive. And I had a similar type, except that instead of being a feeler, I was a thinker, meaning that where Ardeth relied upon feelings to sort out the value of what she was intuitively taking in from the world, I turned to analysis. Joe also conducted a bunch of tests to determine which professions Ardeth and I were best suited for. In Ardeth's case, it was sort of like a little experimental lab living with them, I've got to say, you know. But in Ardeth's case, I believe it was nursing was her preferred occupation, which she eventually gravitated to later in life. For me, it was writing and reporting. And my less suitable occupation was what I was doing at the time, which was business management. So when I did finally pursue a career some years later, it was indeed as a magazine writer and editor. But within a couple of years, I gravitated to the least of my talents in becoming the magazine's publisher. And then I went on for the next 35 years running media companies with absolutely no business management training whatsoever, aside from those tutorials from Joe and Ardeth, and Ardeth's on-the-job coaching in that office in Munich, which always stayed with me. It was the same with education. I hated the idea of going to college. But as an autodidact, I was a complete failure, overwhelmed with information. Ardeth and Joe helped me to see that the T for thinker in my Myers-Briggs profile meant that I needed some formal training in critical thinking to make sense of what I was taking in. And once again, Ardeth stepped in as my mentor. She had attended Pomona College, as we heard, for a couple of years before marrying her first husband, James. And after Robin and Leslie were born, the family moved to Oregon for Jim's residency. And thanks to help from her widowed mother at the time, Ardeth was able to enroll in Reed College in Portland. There she found her intellectual home and absolutely thrived. She thought I would too. And as fate would have it, Reed had only one study abroad program in the world, and it was in the University of Munich. And Joe connected me with the Reedy students studying there, and after hanging out with them for a while, I realized Ardeth was right. I had found my people. So with her help, I applied to Reed. It was the only college I ever applied to. We both agreed it was fate or nothing. And surprisingly, I was accepted. Now today, thanks to Ardeth, I am not only a Reed College graduate, I am a long-serving member of the college's Board of Trustees. Now, Ardeth and Joe returned to the States before me, settling up in Campeche in Mendocino County, and I visited them on my way to Reed just before Joe passed away. And some 10 years later, my wife and I moved to Bernal Heights in San Francisco. And not long afterward, Ardeth returned from her sojourn with the Peace Corps in Costa Rica and took an apartment nearby in the Mission. And she house sat for us when we traveled out of town, taking care of our 2 Jack Russell Terriers, who, like all animals, were naturally drawn to her kind, caring spirit. Ardeth and I also volunteered together at the local food bank in Bernal Heights, making monthly food deliveries to people in need, mostly in the projects. I carried in the food while Ardeth greeted everyone with her generous smile and upbeat manner, mentoring me once again in the characteristics that opened doors wherever she went: courage, curiosity, and compassion. On the path laid out before you, wrote the poet Gary Snyder, others have already been that way and picked all the berries. In order to get your own berries, you need to leave the path and make your own trail. On her personal odyssey in this life, Ardeth not only carved out her own trail and got her own berries, but she inspired me, and I'm sure countless others, to do the same, for which I am eternally grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I think it is time to raise our voices in song, and so I'd invite you, the gray hymnal that you turned to earlier has Artie's favorite hymn, or one of them, 163. I invite you to rise in body or spirit as you're able, and let's sing it together. Please be seated. And so we release you, Ardeth, with kisses and song, with testimony and tears into the life beyond the veil of what is known, and carrying so much of you inside us that it is amazing that there was more beyond what you gave us. Let your life be as a bride to amazement, bridegroom that took the whole world into your arms. Surrender and merge into larger life that carries us all eventually beyond these shores. In ripples and tides that we add to as we can, sweeping what is forever beyond our reach, knowing it was fed and blessed and enriched by our living. Know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you did not end up simply visiting this world, but played your gorgeous part in its symphony. Blessings and love beyond limits wherever you are, Ardeth Billings Fortier, in your next adventure. I'd invite us now to rise, as we did before pandemic, but I think we know enough about fomites that we're all safe. And if you don't want to join hands, just put your arms across your chest and people can extend their arms in your direction. So let's connect into one interdependent family as we say our benediction. And then are seated again for the music that was chosen, and then everybody, of course, invited to a reception, which includes, I believe, the centering of coffee and chocolate, again, by orders from above. And now in our comings and our goings, may the light of life, of love, come out from within us, be gracious unto us, and grant us all peace. For this is the day we are given. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Amen.